Thank you all for joining us today. Before we begin our panel discussion, I'd like to just acknowledge for those of us in the city of Toronto that we're on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, and the Wendat people. And this territory is now home to many diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. Second, you will see that there's a little Q&A box on the bottom right-hand corner. Please feel free to enter your questions there. And after our discussion, we'll try to get to as many questions as we can, whatever time permits. Yeah, thank you all for joining. We're excited to have this discussion. As you know, our conversation today centers on why women of color who have been leaning in for decades are still largely absent from decision-making tables in corporations and organizations across Canada. Next slide, please. Data indicates women of color born in Canada have some of the highest levels of academic qualifications. Other studies have consistently shown that women of color are highly ambitious professionals, joining corporations with the goal to move to senior roles. Yet women of color continue to be overrepresented in lower wage roles and underrepresented or entirely absent in senior or executive roles. In fact, McKinsey & Company's 2020 Women in the Workplace report found that while 19% of C-suite roles are held by white women, only 4% are held by racialized women. In Toronto, a study conducted by Ryerson University found that while there are far more racialized women professionals, non-racialized women outnumber racialized women in senior roles 12-1. The next slide provides another view or a look at the disparities that exist when you go beyond gender and look at race. You'll notice that the total number of male and female racialized professionals roughly equals the number of non-racialized women in board positions. Women of color continue to experience great challenges. One could even say that the glass ceiling for racialized women is truly concrete. Women of color are reported to receive lower levels of support in corporations and organizations, and efforts to increase gender diversity have not adequately addressed the magnitude of issues that racialized women face. The one-size-fits-all approach to gender diversity efforts have not benefited racialized women, Indigenous women, or trans women. One of the reasons why is that often these efforts fail to acknowledge intersectionality. Intersectionality is how race, class, gender, or other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap. These social characteristics create interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. This term intersectionality was coined by an African-American lawyer and professor, Kimberly Crenshaw. She coined the term after doing three studies. She was looking at three legal cases that covered both racial and gender discrimination. The one was a case from 1976 where 5 Black women attempted to sue General Motors for a seniority policy that they argued targeted Black women specifically. Basically, the company did not hire Black women until 1964. And when they had seniority-based layoffs in the early 1970s because of a recession, all the Black women hired after 1964, which was every Black woman in the company, they were laid off. A policy like that didn't fall under gender discrimination, just gender discrimination, or just race discrimination. But because it didn't fall into one or the other, the courts decided that the claim was unworkable and that the 5 women had no case. To dig deeper and increase our understanding of what barriers racialized women face and what actions we need to consider, I am thrilled to introduce our panel today. We have Narinder Dhami. Narinder is a managing partner at Marigold Capital. Marigold Capital invests in founders with technology-enabled products and services that deliver value to women, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and other underserved groups. Narinder is also a renowned leader in the social finance space. We have Leen Li. She's the Chief Executive Officer of Wealthsimple Foundation. And prior to this, Leen was the Chief Financial Officer at Wealthsimple, a leading financial technology company with a mission to help everyone achieve financial freedom by providing products and services that are accessible and affordable. And we have Nadia. Nadia is the SVP of Global Government Affairs and Industry Relations at Maple Leaf Foods. Prior to joining Maple Leaf Foods, Nadia had spent over 20 years with the Canadian Federal Public Service, where she built a reputation for forging strong partnerships with government and business leaders, managing complex priority trade files, and leading multidisciplinary teams. Thank you all three for being here today and your willingness to share your experiences and insights with us. I'd like to start our conversation today by asking why you feel progress has been so slow for racialized women. And if possible, it would be wonderful if you could share some of your examples of the experiences you have as you've moved and navigated corporate environments. Narinder, perhaps you could start?
Yeah, thank you. Well, thanks for being here. It's really great to be alongside all three amazing ladies. And I think this is such an important conversation that we're having today. And until, I'd say, 2020, it was actually difficult to have this conversation about women of color and the intersectionality that we hold. And so, when you look across the last 2 decades where we have seen progress in diversity and in, the conversation of gender has actually been fairly present in boardrooms, in senior leadership. However, gender has benefited primarily women of white women. And so I think that has been a big challenge. And we often have this binary view of good and bad. So, if we're checking off gender, we're checking off white women, we're good. We're on the right pace. We're kind of progressing toward that equity that we're talking about. But we're not stepping back to see all of those blind spots, all of the things and all of the people who are being left out of that conversation. And so right now, one of the things we do is invest in women and people of color. And what gives me a lot of hope and energy is that we're seeing that their boards are more diverse. When you start looking at the data of private companies, the numbers aren't great, and they're actually worse than public companies in terms of diversity of women and women of color. But at least the shift that we're seeing of recognizing that capital needs to flow into businesses that are run by women of color, I think is going to have that domino effect. My journey for a really long time, I've reported into boards, and that's been about a decade, and have had a mixed journey of it. As a woman of color, I also fall under, the Asian minority stereotype. So I'm a hard worker, I'm smart, I could really crunch the numbers, but I'm not a leader. And so it's, we can get into the nitty gritty, but there's so many times when I just disagreeing becomes that I'm angry. And so you're kind of daily, you're trying to figure out and navigate these conversations, still trying to hold your own and still trying to kind of build what you're trying to build, but having this additional layer of challenges like these, mosquito bites that continue to, in some ways, weigh you down. So part of me is optimistic. I've seen a lot of progress. We can have these conversations. We have a long way to go. And, my journey has been very colored in terms of the experiences I faced with boards.
Thank you, Narinder. Leen, we'd love to also hear your point of view on this as well. You came to Canada to study English, and you had already worked in China, in the financial world in China prior to coming here. What do you feel are some of the barriers and some of the reasons for why progress has been slow, and in some cases there's been no progress?
Thank you, Shilpa. First, thank you for having me on these important conversations as well. I think for me, because I call it adulthood immigrant experience to Canada, gave me probably a little bit different perspective, or maybe a little bit naive at the very beginning of my career. A lot of times, I think it's still true in a way that I didn't get that promotion, or I got shut down, or I was cut off. I try to really think it's because of my language, my communications, until I think when in the room is senior enough to see other women or other women of color, they were born here in Canada, they speak perfect English, they're very articulate, and then they had some sort of similar experience or situations, and was like making me start to thinking about, maybe it's maybe my English is only part of the reason why, and it's probably not the primary reason why. I think that was kind of a different perspective. But to Narinder's point is like I was just reading the chart and figures like I'm not surprised. And that is the representation of the reality even today. I think things get better. Things get lots better for a white woman over the last many years, but the social movement and all the corporations trying to do certain things, but I don't think things has got dramatically better or slightly better for racialized women. The story or the picture hasn't changed. So it's kind of also interesting is like this is happened to me a few years back. That in a very senior meetings, walk in, there's 20 people in the meeting rooms. After a couple of years, I was like made observation to say, hey, you know what, like I'm still the only woman of color in this room out of 20 plus people, very senior. The immediate response, I still remember that day. The immediate response is, oh, but we have more women right now compared to 2 years ago. So I didn't know how I felt at that time. We're speaking both facts and realities, but I think one of the challenge that I observed over the last few years in terms of movement is there's definitely a big step of progress toward diversity, but that diversity strategy is not as inclusive. So left a big part of the population out. I think that was kind of, if I just say something like that, is like we haven't really put, or we, meaning the business world, hasn't really put lots of focus on really looking at intersectionality side of it. And then made a lot of racialized women become the only one or the only two in most rooms they're in. There are a few times it made me feel I'm special, but the most times made me feel like I'm lonely. So I think that's the toll on me as an individual person, and also just kind of the observation part of it on that. And I don't know other people's experience, but just like for me, what I experienced is I do see the progress, but people look like us, not white, are left out.
Yeah. Thank you, Leen. And what I appreciate is that focus on only, because being the only person, I saw a study, I think it was by Catalyst, how when you're the only person that looks like you in a room, you need to work twice as hard to be credible in terms of what you're saying. And I know I've, like you, and I think also like Nadia and Narinder and many other racialized women have been the only, and it is exhausting. It is very, very exhausting to be the only. There is that moment of feeling maybe perhaps special because you made it, but the loneliness is far more significant. And Nadia yourself, you've had the opportunity to live and work outside of Canada as well as in Canada. I'd love to hear your perspective. We'd love to also add your perspective and your lens to this as someone who's worked inside and outside of Canada, worked for the federal government, and also now a private company. What do you feel is holding back racialized women, and what are some of your experiences and as a racialized woman in both the private sector but also the public sector?
Thank you. This is such a fantastic conversation that is long. I hope we have many more of these, monthly chats where we invite people, honestly, because I think that we could talk all day about this. I wrote down when Leen said, most times I don't feel special in the room, I just feel lonely. And I'll talk about maybe a few of my experiences in a minute, but if I think about the couple of things, or the three things that are really holding back women that look like us from reaching senior levels in corporate Canada. And I want to make a distinction, actually. I'm going to make a distinction between corporate Canada and the nonprofit sector in a second. I think it's a couple of things. Number one, I think that in particular over the last several years, our social dialogue around diversity and equity and inclusion has gotten really sophisticated and very refined. You know, we have gotten very good at making pledges, at shouting out that new hire that we've brought into the organization that might look like us. You know, everybody now knows the buzzwords to use and not to use, and you know, to call themselves an ally and a sponsor and a mentor, and right, the language around equity and diversity in particular, has gotten really good, really sophisticated. So it has allowed most people to engage in the dialogue without actually committing or engaging in the action. So most people at the senior levels of corporate Canada and corporate America, I would say, although to be honest with you, corporate America is doing way better than we are, frankly. Most people at those decision-making tables in corporate Canada, you know, can have the dialogue and have it very well and point to a couple of examples and point to like mentors that they have and initiatives that they're sponsoring. But the real accountability, the brass tacks, right? Just like you would for any other P&L line in your company, is not there, because we have this sophisticated dialogue that we have created that gets us far enough. And I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is really around the mentality that we have as a nation of this pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality. And so what that creates is a sense of, you know, me, Leen, Narinder, Shilpa, you know, we want to get, we are smart women. We want to get to the C-suite. We want to be a CEO. We want to be, you know, on corporate boards. And this pull yourself up by the bootstraps mentality teaches us that for sure, you know, people have to make space for us 100%. But we have to make sure that we lean in, you know, we have to make sure that we find those mentors and find those sponsors. We have to make sure that we, you know, make the right decisions about our career and seize those opportunities when they present themselves to us. There's this whole narrative around what we need to do. That, and part of it is that, don't get me wrong, 100%. But the conversation that we miss out on, that we don't emphasize on is this really my problem though? Like really, is it a me problem? I'm not sure that it's a me problem. We don't have that conversation enough, right? And there was this fantastic article that I tweeted yesterday or the day before. And it was all around why women of, I think the title was Black women, but when you read it, you know, women of color aren't getting into the C-suite. And, you know, the fact of the matter is that with women of color in particular, the onus is always placed on us to do more. And anything externally from us that is done is seen as a favor. It's seen as, you know, this extra special thing that we're asking for in order to help us get somewhere. And this article was so powerful because it really spoke about the whole idea of sponsorship is it actually what has gotten men where they are. And they gave very concrete examples of all of the men that were sponsored by their male mentors at one point, and that's how they got where they are. So we're not actually asking for anything different. We're asking to get next. You know, we want next. That's all we're asking for. And so I think that piece is also very important in terms of unpacking why we are still so far from really reaching the most senior levels. And then quickly, I'll just say one more thing, because it's Narinder that actually it triggered something for me, because it actually just happened to me this morning. You know, more often than not, and I think actually Leen mentioned it as well, more often than not, women of color, racialized women, are not given their dues. We are most often seen at a much lower level than we are. When we speak, when we present ourselves, when we are around a board table, we have to work twice as hard and speak twice as long and give twice as many examples for our point of view to be given credit. And I think that's real, right? Like some might look at that conversation and say, well, it's not all about titles, and it's not all about getting credit, and it's not all about, actually, yes, it is. In fact, it is very much about titles. It is very much about getting those steps in the rung to get you where you are, getting those praises for what you have done, getting that credit for the successes that you have had. And more often than not, women, and particularly women of color, are again provided this narrative that, well, you should just focus on doing what you love, focus on, being an empathetic leader, focus on all of those soft things that really, we're pretty good at already. So thanks. What we really need is credit for the hard stuff, right? That we do. And we need to be given the recognition when we're at the table, but also when we're not at the table, when people are speaking for us in rooms to get us to the next level. And I think that does not happen enough. And that's also a barrier. I'll leave it there.
There's just a few before all three of you, thank you. There are a few things I'd love to pull on a little bit further. One, the resilience. I know as a racialized woman, I'm tired of being told the need to be resilient. I think we've been resilient enough. I don't think the question should be about resiliency. Second, in terms of mentorship, and Leen had a great story of mentorship. I had a conversation with Leen for a podcast that I host, and where she talked about her experience with mentorship. Because I find in the corporate world, the idea of mentorship is really about how can you fit in and move forward looking like everyone else or behaving like everyone else. And I find particularly for racialized people, it's about standing out. It's about how we use our uniqueness to shine and move forward and create change. Because right now we need to shake things up, and our uniqueness should be embraced as a way, and should be seen as a way to shake things up. Before we move, I would love, because there's so much conversation right now about sponsorship and mentorship and the need for mentors, and how racialized women have a harder time finding sponsorship and mentorship. Perhaps, Narinder, if we could start with you, could you just speak to mentorship or sponsorship and what that's been like for you as a racialized woman? Has it been effective? I'd love to know more. And Leen, I'd love for you to also share your experience.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. So I've had mentors. I have currently mentors. I've had, I think, a few sponsors as well. Probably the balance isn't there within my journey of having more sponsors. That said, I remember I spent a brief moment in investment banking, and they were very eager to maintain women of color and women as part of it. So I had a mentor, and they really set you up in a structure. But it didn't resonate. It never, that journey didn't resonate. And the forced mentorship has not resonated, in part because it's the problem. And Nadia was touching on this, like the problem is not me. It makes the problem my problem. And I think that's a wrong framing if we actually want to change things. When mentorship has worked, they've been organic relationships that have been created through shared interests, focus areas, just something there. And I've enabled and learned and just thrived through those types of journey. I think sponsorship is really critical. I think having folks talk about you when you're not in the room, to elevate you, give you access to opportunities. I was talking, a former advisor of mine was the head of one of the big law firms. And we were chatting many years ago about the fact that it was hard for women to move up the ranks, but part of it was they were never given the exciting, cool opportunity to show themselves. And so you need sponsorship to be enabled with those opportunities. And if you're not given the opportunity on these things, then you'll never shine and never be able to get to that next level. And when folks give opportunities, they often give it to folks they think will be able to execute, and folks they think they will be able to execute look more like them.
And Leen, perhaps you can share your experience, because your story was I really appreciated your story and found it very insightful. Your experience earlier on in your career in Canada with mentorship and how that enabled you.
I think, like, if you look at my journey to today, one of the things that I feel very lucky is actually the ability to meet a lot of successful people that can help my career, but also were willing to mentor me and coach me, and also to sponsor me, right? So some are luck, that just organically lucky. And the story I told Shilpa was like organically starting with just a pure luck. Some are managed or thoughtfully seek the luck, right? So I have another story. I feel, because I feel like sometimes when I tell people, especially younger people now, I'm mentoring some people, just like when I tell the story, was like, you know, as a racialized woman, as a minority, even though you grew up in Canada, you're not having the same access. So one of the things, unfortunately, what you have to do is how to create those access for yourself, right? And there shouldn't be shame about it. Like, no one's going to just give you the project just because you work hard and you're smart, right? In order to actually to show you, people know that, oh my God, Leen is working hard and smart and is capable to do it. Somebody has to say something about Leen being that. And how to create that person, I think is very thoughtful exercise and practice that we should be feeling very open, not ashamed to talk about it. Like, create your own opportunity to meet the next person. That's fine, right? The thing, like the story I told Shilpa in the past, was the very first full-time. So leave it background, like I came here when I was 25 as an international student. I got my first undergrad degree in China, and I worked in China for 5 years in one of the largest banks. The lots of privilege we'll talk about in Canada, I had all those privileges as a Chinese in China. So, and then when I came to this country, you know, I lost all of those. And after I got my master's degree in Canada, I got my first job. My job type is a junior accountant. I left China as a manager, right? So it was a very different mentality for me. But in that tech company, our CEO was thinking to expand to Asia. And he kind of needs somebody to, like, within a company who actually understands Asian culture, particularly Chinese culture, because China at that time became like more attractive. That was like 15 years ago. There was 3 Chinese in the company, in the tech company. 2 are men, 1 is a woman. So I'm the right, and the CEO was a man. So he, of course, went to the other 2 men. Like, there's nothing wrong with that, right? And then lucky for me, that none of them had the time. They both had just like new baby. I think I remember none of them had time. They had to go home. So I just came to Toronto. There's nobody, no family. All I have is time. So I was able to actually build that personal connection with the CEO at that time, who was actually had ambitions to go to China and want to learn the language and the culture. Like that's where I built the connection. So that was a pure luck at the very beginning. But going through that exercise and that relationship, it's a little bit forced at the very beginning because, well, I'm the only one I want to do it. But it gave me the opportunity to understand the business vision and the mission and everything, the strategy more in detail coming from the CEO. And that flash of knowledge really bring me my thought process and my recommendations, the things I think we should do to a very different level, right? And then it also gave the CEO the opportunity to know me, not just as a person on paper as a junior accountant in the back office doing the bills, that I had a brain and I had some sort of experience, maybe not exactly relevant, but I had a brain, I had like the ambitions, I had the things that needed to be done to get certain things done. So because that mentorship led me to lead the Asian expansion project within the company, that's where really get me to the next step, right? Like I was almost certain if I didn't have this relationship with the CEO, like I have to teach him about Chinese and Chinese culture, I won't be considered for that project. Doesn't really matter how many hours I worked. Like this is the ugly truth. So with that experience, it really gave me a different perspective on what mentorship and sponsorship can be to me. At that time, I didn't know the words. I don't think there was a word about mentorship or sponsorship back 15 years ago, but really gave me a different perspective. It's like, okay, well, in order for me to be seen as a very capable person, I need to create those bugs.
Yeah.
And then when I move on to my different careers, there's not necessarily the luck that every single company wants to go to China, but I was able to actually use that experience to say, well, what the things I have is very unique, that can use that uniqueness to build connections with people who have seat on the table, certain things, and then to show them that I'm capable and I can do the job, I can do the project, and to be the project that most impactful for the business and getting those opportunities. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I think it's those years of exercise and thoughtful planning and thinking get me to where I am. Like I think to close this kind of the topic from my perspective is like there's we all need a level of luck to be successful. But we also need to know how to create those lucks ourselves because they don't just like falling around from the sky most times.
Thank you, Leen. And Nadia, could you maybe touch on mentorship and sponsorship and what that's meant for you? Has that been effective? How you've been able to find mentors or sponsors? And again, it's because I've been hearing so much about mentorship and sponsorship, and I've struggled with mentorship because, as I mentioned, I feel it's about fitting in, not standing out. And as Narinder mentions, it's and Leen as well, it's not easy to find sponsors when you don't look like everyone else. So perhaps you can provide, and also because of your work in America, perhaps you can also add some light on your experiences with that in the U.S. context as well, if you feel inclined.
Yeah, what I would say is I agree 100% with you, Shilpa, that, mentorship, in my experience, when I have been mentored, most times it is with a view of teaching me how to fit in. Right? Teaching me how to play the game. In fact, that's how it used to be framed, right? You need to find somebody to show you how to play the game. And I agree with Leen. I think, there is, let's not be Pollyanna about it, right? There is a certain degree of playing the game, 100%. But I do think that if we are truly interested in getting more racialized women, and we're having a conversation here around racialized women, but there's a whole conversation that I think needs to be had about Indigenous women who, we do need to, I'm certainly not speaking for anybody, but I think we need to acknowledge that they are not racialized, and we are all of us settlers, frankly. And so there is a different conversation to me around Indigenous women and their rightful space and place in corporate Canada, and at the most senior levels of decision making in the country. And from the way that I see it, if we are truly going to have those conversations, there needs to be a discussion around using mentorship, not to teach people how to fit in fact, using mentorship as a way of gaining more knowledge around what the uniqueness of people can bring to an organization, and figuring out how to marry those two to propel people forward. To me, that's what mentorship should be evolving into. And I don't think we're there yet. I think that, there are pieces, there are pockets, I think, of people who get it or want to get it. But I don't think we're there yet. And, sponsorship, I could talk a lot about this because I've been doing a lot of thinking about it lately, in particular, over the past year, in particular, 2 years. I think it is so important for people to understand that if you are looking to consider yourself a sponsor, part of your job is not just to, wax poetic about how wonderful people are when they're not in the room, and to provide them those opportunities. That is definitely part of it. But more importantly, when the decisions are being made in those rooms, and the people that are challenging somebody's readiness, somebody's competence to do it, or are bringing up the narrative of, oh, but she seems kind of angry, she's always, she seems a little bit angry, or, I'm not sure her employees think she's a bit rough, a bit, I don't know, If you really want to be a sponsor, part of your job is actually to raise your hand and say, whoa, a second here. Why are we having this narrative about Narinder, about Nadia, about Leen, about Shilpa? Did we have that narrative about Bob? Because I'm pretty sure not everybody in his staff loves him either. If you want to be loved, sell ice cream, right? Don't be a leader is the quote, right? So loved by everybody, right? That is part of, and I would say a more important part of sponsorship. Because I think, again, and going back to my initial part of where we have come to in the conversation around equity and diversity, we've gotten really good at, piling on to the loveliness of people, right? Piling on to praise them and, oh, so many wonderful people and et cetera, but still we have not made progress, right? And I think I'm still thinking about it. But I really do think that is the rub, that more often with women and women that look like us, and Indigenous women, we are most often challenged in ways that our white counterparts are not. And the sponsorship piece is to be brave enough to be that person that challenges your colleagues in that room as to why they are perpetuating that narrative. And to take a stand to say, no. To me, that is what is missing from the conversation around sponsorship.
Thank you, Nadia. I think you all three raise really important points. And Nadia, your point about the perception of angry, it was interesting. I had, and for recognizing that the conversation with Indigenous women is a very different conversation, and a very, very important conversation that we need to most certainly have, because we're not seeing representation, and there are so many brilliant Indigenous men and women that we're not seeing, where we're not seeing, they're not represented in our society. And just touching on that, and performance reviews, because I was in the podcast I host, I spoke with a brilliant Métis Cree lawyer, Myrna McCallan, and she worked for the government, and she talked about a number of aspects of her career, and one was the performance review aspect, how it would pull on stereotypes, the angry Indigenous women, the angry South Asian women, and for her it was particularly pulling on the angry Indigenous women, instead of thinking about why she may not have joined a party for an employee who's having a baby, maybe because she didn't feel like she belonged in that space. She was angry. She was the angry Indigenous lawyer. And so I think those conversations about questioning how we stereotype our colleagues based on these things that we hear, our existing images we have, is very, very important. My next question to all of you is pulling on, what levers can we use to create change? We've talked about sponsorship and mentorship, and for me, and I believe I've had this parts of this conversation with, I think, Narinder, is like, in Canada, a country where we really speak to the value of multiculturalism and the value of immigration. I would have imagined that diversity and inclusion we would see it more, we would experience it more in our corporations and organizations. And Nadia, it's interesting you say you've seen more in the US than in terms of diversity and where racialized women are in the corporate world in the US versus Canada. And so I think, that alone, our nation and our identity as a multicultural society should be enough of a lever to create big change. What levers do you feel we have to move this dialogue forward? Because we are having lots of conversations, but I don't want to wait another 100 years before, I don't want this to be my daughter's issue. So I don't want it to be your daughter's issue, Nadia. What levers do we have, both in the government and also within corporations and organizations? And Narinder, perhaps you could start.
Yeah, no, it's such a great question. I think in Canada, we've perfected the performance of diversity and equity. Diversity is our greatest strength. We take the knee, like we do all of those things without actually doing the work to drive the change that we're looking to drive. I heard this analogy, which I'll share. It was about, say a company had a sales problem, right? You wouldn't host a series of honest conversations on how we appreciate sales. You wouldn't go and then put on programming for like a month-long thing about how sales are really important to us. You would actually look into the business process and look at where the bottlenecks are, where additional resources, where the pain points are, what needs to change, and then change them. And so often I think we're having the wrong conversation on diversity and equity because we're trying to have that emotional conversation, but not really the practical and the business conversation of why we should be having it. And so, looking at like how many folks have pledged, I think a lot of people made a lot of pledges in 2020, but how many went back and looked at their performance review process, their hiring processes, the implicit and explicit bias that exist. It's not going to be a one workshop, one conversation solution. It's going to be a more kind of proactive approach to seeing this as a business problem. And then, I think numbers and metrics matter. And so we need to benchmark and we need to have targets and we need to report on those targets. And so I think we need to move from that performance that we do within Canada in particular, because we're good people doing good work and we're diverse and inclusive, and move into that action.
Right, and just in terms of numbers matter and data, do you think, because my work has been in sustainability, I see lots of KPIs, I see data, but there's also ways to present data so it looks better than it is. Is there a need to actually break and pull apart data so we actually get a true sense of what is happening? Because I've seen numbers in companies, and I think that, that's not true. Like, I know pay equity is not at 100% in this company.
Yeah, I think it's such a good point because we don't disaggregate the data. We just, and this is why women of color fall between the cracks, because we say gender, and gender equates to white women and white women's progress and not folks who look like us. And so disaggregating the data at different levels, disaggregating it on kind of different intersectionality points is so critical. And then the one conversation we never have is class, and how much class influences all of what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Leen, what do you feel in terms of what levers we can pull on?
I was preparing to the panel yesterday, I actually wrote down exactly what Narinder just said. It's like, this is like diversity, inclusion, and equity is a business problem. So solve it like a business problem, right? Have a business case. Like, we for profit or not for profit, when we think about a business case or a program we run, that we set North Star metric, right? This is where we want to go. And then we design a path to get there. And then along the way, you have different processes, you got the funnels, you put the resources together, you look at the market and do those things. Like, there's nothing different in this diversity, inclusion, and equity sense. It's like, do that, right? Like, using like back to like the sales conversation, right? Most sales organization will have not just only have a sales target, revenue target, they also have activity targets, right? What's your top of funnel? What's mid of funnel? What's your conversion? What's your activities, right? Then all of those things treat as a business problem, and then staff up with the proper resources. It's like, if you launch a product, if you have nobody working on this or everybody working part-time, you're not going to have successful product launch, like, right? This or common sense. I think that's the thing. Second, the piece is really accountability. Is like, let's just use sales as an example. How a sales team is comped, right? They comped by achieving their target. So there is a very level tied up is like, not just setting a target become more inspiring dream or in 50 years, whatever. It's like, can we actually tie the leadership team, the people in power, can we actually tie their personal compensation? Like, I'm a finance person, I always think about it. It's like, one thing to design is like the target or not target to set up that needs to be accountable by a group of people who actually can make real difference in the organization. So like, I think that piece, I think it will be really important. Like, also the things, if talking about the data, is how to separate the data, is to say, there are much less racialized women on the top, but if you take that percentage and you look at the entry level, there are lots more, right? And then so there's more on the bottom, not enough not on the top. So how a corporation organization can create a process internally is like, instead, we need increase the racialized women representation, or we need hire more women, let's go outside to find this woman. Can we actually start with the inside to say, we get people here, can we design the program, mentorship, sponsorship, targeted training to actually grow your existing workforce to be taking that role, right? Like, I think we need to do all of that. It's not going to be a overnight exercise. And as much as I have a big hope, I don't think this is one generation's solution. I think would take more than one generation, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is. It's unfortunate to hear that, because when my father worked as an engineer in Canada, I would often hear about the challenges he faced as a racialized male, and I always thought, this is not going to exist. This problem is not going to exist when I'm in the corporate world. It most certainly won't, because this is Canada. We value diversity. We value multiculturalism, and so and like you, Leen, I've realized that this might actually be something my daughter is going to talk about as well, which I find so unfortunate. Nadia, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about what levers you think we can pull on to hopefully move the dials to some extent in our generation.
Yeah, I exactly what Leen and Narinder said, I think is exactly right. And I think that the barrier towards the measurement and the accountability is really, again, going back to this idea of, Canada being very uncomfortable with being uncomfortable. right? Because it will take being uncomfortable, frankly.
Mhm.
And I think that that is something that is hard for people to wrap their heads around. There was a comment that came up in the chat, and I just wanted to address it because somebody asked, and I'm just going to address it from my perspective because I think it's such a good question that I would love to actually get people's perspective on, like you ladies and maybe others even later on if you want to send me a note on LinkedIn or something. So somebody was asking whether there was Indigenous representation on the panel. And I have to say, and again, this is, my view of the world. I just think that the conversation around my experience and the experience of Indigenous people and Indigenous women is so different. And I often cringe, to be frank, when I hear a conversation around racialized women that includes Indigenous women, because they are not like, this is their land. They are not racialized. They are not people of color. They are. I just feel like it deserves a whole conversation that is led by Indigenous people, and with me as a listener, frankly, and a learner. And so I would love to hear what other people think about that, but I think that there's always this juxtaposition around white people and then Indigenous people and people that look like us, kind of all mixed up in the same boat. And I just think, no, in fact, I have to, when we're talking about Indigenous women and Indigenous peoples and their, whatever it is that we're talking about to get them to wherever it is that we need them to be, or they need to be, or they want to be in decision-making spaces in corporate Canada or wherever, that's a conversation that I need to be a listener in, right? That's not a conversation, frankly, that I that I can opine on, frankly. I need to be in listening mode, in my view, to have a conversation about then how I can help be part of the solution. So the people that we're talking about in our conversation around what needs to be done, and we say this is not an us problem, that's somebody else's problem. To me, we're also part of the problem when it comes to Indigenous peoples and and why they are not represented at the highest levels, right? So we need to be on the other side of that fence for that conversation. So that's my point of view. I don't know if others, and I don't know if that's why there's no Indigenous representation on the panel, but that is my point of view, and I have struggled with it, frankly, in particular when I was in the United States and I was representing Canada as the Consul General to the Southeast USA, because we did a lot of these panels, and there was always a call to kind of make sure we have an Indigenous person. And I would always say, well, why don't we have a conversation led by an Indigenous person about the Indigenous experience on X, Y, and Z that we're talking about? And because to me, it's a different conversation. And it's a conversation that I don't feel that I am the leader on, not right. I'm the listener and the learner. So anyway, I saw it in the chat and I wanted to address it because I actually would welcome a conversation around it. Either maybe not now, obviously, but later.
I think you make an important point, Nadia, and the fact that we need to listen to that conversation. I mean, just even I'm just pulling that further, even the conversation around things like climate change. Indigenous people manage 80% of our natural resources, yet we rarely see them in conversations at the table on a climate change conversation. I can't unfortunately see the chat, but for me, I felt that the conversation around racialized women was different than the conversation around Indigenous women, and I didn't want that to be diluted. I think there needs to be a panel where Indigenous women where we are the audience. Sorry, you're muted, Nadia.
Oh no, sorry, I was going to say exactly where that conversation is centered. Again, in my opinion, like I'd love to have a conversation around it.
Before we move, Narinder or Leen, did you want to comment on that? I'm also mindful of time now that
I agree. Like I'm just in much alignment with what you both said.
We have 4 minutes left. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time for questions. I'm hoping that through our conversation, we've connected or touched on some of the questions that we have. The last question I have, and again, we only have about 4 minutes to answer it, is really on the notion of allyship, because another term that we hear a lot about, and I find the term allyship to be a bit hollow. I don't understand what it means. Who's an ally? Who's not? What are the actions you take to be an ally? Am I an ally? Am I not an ally? And so I was wondering in the last few minutes that we have, if each of you could touch on this, because I do think we need a little bit more color in terms of what that means, because it's just another sophisticated term, another pretty term to add to the conversation. Narinder, did you want to maybe say a few things about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've mentioned this in kind of the conversation. I think it's easy to say you're an ally. It's hard to actually, or it takes courage. Shouldn't take courage, but it does unfortunately take courage to be a real ally. So, it's easy behind the Twitter, on Twitter or kind of on the internet to share language and again, be that performative ally. And so what we need is folks that are willing to speak up when they see bias, willing to speak up when they see discrimination, willing to speak up when people are being passed for opportunities. And we need more of that, like true allyship, if we want to make any change. And I've had an experience of having some true allies who have done that. But I must say I have more people in my career journey who would say they're allies, but then when it gets tough, kind of start to hide behind become fairly quiet in that journey. So, if you're going to be one, and we need that. The one little fact I'll share, HBR had a recent article or a few years ago, and they were talking about how women and people of color, when they hire diverse individuals, women and people of color, they're actually penalized for that. So we need to really think about how we kind of really change the broader system of corporations.
Leen, did you want to touch on what allyship means to you, or and what you think we could be talking about in terms of allyship?
Yeah, I agree with what Narinder just said. One thing I think, particularly on the individual personal life level, allyship to me was, to Nadia's point, I think she mentioned that, is to be able to have those uncomfortable conversations to help solving my problem, right? Being a good ally means that the person needs to be able to take the risk to get hurt in order to help me. I think that's very important to me in terms of allyship. There's a lot of things to be built into that. We don't really have the time to do it, but just like having those uncomfortable conversations, are willing to take a risk in getting hurt because you want to help me and you want to help people like me.
And Nadia, thoughts on the term allyship?
I just agree with what Narinder and Leen said. I mean, I think that we have to remember that it's a verb, it's not a noun, and act like it. And make sure that it's a conversation, right? Make sure that you're remembering to ask the people that you are purporting to support what they need, and then act on that.
I'd like to, we're at 1:30, exactly, right on the dot. I'd like to thank the three of you for sharing so much of your thoughts, your experience, and your insights. It takes courage to have this conversation. We're always the conversations around race have been uncomfortable, and we need more of them. As Nadia, you mentioned, monthly conversations, and we need additional conversations that acknowledge the Indigenous men and women's experience as well. And I'm hoping that over this course of this year, we start having all of the many difficult conversations we need to have, and we also start to see a lot more diversity at the table when we have these conversations. I'll take a look at, for the audience, I'm going to take a look at the questions and see what we can answer, and any questions that are specific to the panelists, I will send them to the panelists. Please feel free to connect with the panelists, myself, or Corporate Knights over Twitter. All of us are on Twitter. And please, continue to ask questions. All of us are open to questions, and we hope to have many more of these conversations. Thank you so much, the three of you. Thank you, Nadia, Leen, Narinder. It's been really, really wonderful and insightful, and I hope all of you who participated have found some insight in this as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.